Hello again. I also don't want to give away too many of the stories from the books because I really prefer that you bought those, but I am going to give you a little bit of information about a couple of the stories. There's one particular story that probably was my favorite because of what happened, how it happened, and why it happened. The why is basically always the same reason in all Mike stories. It's because Mike and you and I think about things quite differently. You and I use, or try to use at least, sound judgment in our decision-making process. We usually prepare a plan of attack in advance, hoping that we will avoid injury when we do things. Now as kids, not so much. As adults especially, we do. But in this particular instance, it's not necessarily a plan of attack or that. It just goes to show a little bit about Mike's decision-making process. And this is a story called Mike Falls in Love. And this is my employee, Mike. And you'll have to read a little bit about the kind of pets he likes, skunks and different things like that will help you appreciate just what kind of a nut Mike is. And then you can read and understand a little more about this particular story and how it is that he was able to take a young lady that works at a lumber supply store who is trying to get a raise, and so she's trying to upsell everyone on nail guns, which at this time were quite new in the early 90s there, and still quite expensive. At that point in time, Makita had come out with a line of nail guns, and for the nail gun with the tow head, it was about $687. And so what happened is Mike goes in to pick up some H-clips or hurricane clips, which take the joists, not joists, it's actually from the trusses to the top, to 2x4s that go around the outside wall and fastens them to those with Tico nails. And he was picking those up for us because we were going to give him a job that was worthy of him. So he was going to Tico nail and probably use a couple thousand band-aids to go through and do that, but that's what he was going to do. So in the process of picking those up, she wanted to show him this brand new Makita nail gun with a toenail head for framing nailing. And he, of course, looked at her kind of stupidly, like Mike normally did whenever anybody talked to him, because he wasn't expecting it, or he didn't comprehend it, or he was trying to process it, not quite sure. But that's just what he did. He looked at her stupidly. So instead of talking to him anymore, she did the unthinkable. She touched his elbow, she even grasped it, and then she tugged him the whole 15 feet over to where the display was to show him the toenail framing nailing gun. And of course, this caused Mike to get all happy and giddy inside. It was his special spot, I guess. When you touch a Mike in the elbow, it just makes him really happy. I don't know why, but that's what happens. And here Mike was, he was very happy. And a peculiar process started going on in Mike's head at this point. He started to think. It wasn't something that Mike did very often. We saw him react plenty, but think, no. But here he starts thinking. And so I guess he stood in front of that display for some time because he came back that morning quite late with those H-clips and of course with that nail gun. So he must have thought about it for quite some time before he finally pulled out his checkbook and spent an entire half a month's pay on said nail gun. Now when I saw him show up with this in my truck, a big box that said Makita and had a picture of this framing nailer in it, I was a little bit irritated and upset. And I believe if you were to ask the other guys on the job site, I may have said some unkind things to Mike at that point. I may have referred to him as a mental midget and some other things like that, because I thought that he had charged that on my account. So you can kind of understand where I was at. Because previously we had told Mike that there was no way that he would ever become a carpenter because he couldn't beat nails in. So I thought he was trying to circumvent that whole concept by buying a nail gun at my expense so that he could be a carpenter. It turns out he wasn't. He was in love. When I asked him what would possess you to buy a nail gun, here is the response that I got from Mike. She needed me to buy it. So I said, she needed me to buy it. And then, his very next sentence, without me being able to respond to that odd one, was, I need to get off work a little early tonight. Is that alright? So I kind of hesitated for a minute, scratched my head and said, sure, why not? So I helped him take the nail gun box out of my truck's front seat, deposited it in the back of his truck. Later on that day, about 11:30 or so, 11:45, he left for lunch. He got back on time, but later on I found out that during that period of time where he had left for lunch, he had went to the Blue Caboose on the east side of town, which is a hamburger joint, or was at that point in time. I don't think it exists anymore. And he had bought 2 cheeseburgers, 2 fries, and 2 Cokes. Actually, he bought 1 Coke and 1 Dr. Pepper, I guess is what Randy said. But anyhow, so he bought what he thought was lunch for 2. And he proceeded to go back to the hardware store where the young lady had mistakenly touched his elbow. And he was going to eat lunch with her. He handed her a bag with a hamburger and fries, and then proceeded to ask her, or basically tell her, I guess. He said, I didn't know what kind of drink you liked, so I just got you a Dr. Pepper. And then he puts it there in front of her and proceeds to sit down on a stool at the counter. You and I would have never done this to start with. And then you and I would have looked at the expression on her face if we had done this, and we would have known that I made a mistake. I've overstepped my bounds. I've gone beyond the norm. I have put my foot in it. All these things would start going through our minds, but we're dealing with Mike, and he didn't catch that. So the young lady proceeded to go get her boss, tell her that there was a goofus out front who was making her quite uncomfortable and had brought her lunch whom she had no affiliation with and whom she wanted none with. So her boss went out there and told him that this was not a lunch counter. If he was going to buy something, fine. If not, get lost. So Mike, being Mike, just smiled, got up, left, went out to his truck, finished his lunch, and then drove back to the job site on the other side of town. That was Mike. And that's quite interesting in itself when you think about it. But it doesn't go quite to the level of why he had to leave work early later on that day. You and I would have seen warning signs in the fact that she wanted nothing to do with him and didn't talk to him at lunch. You and I might perhaps have even changed our plans for that afternoon at that point. But a Mike doesn't do that. His mind doesn't work in the way that it needs to process that information correctly. You might think about it as if it were an old K-Pro 286 computer who you're trying to load Windows 10 on and you just can't understand why it won't work. Well, the hardware is not compatible with the software, and that was Mike's problem. Everything in his head that was mechanically there was outdated. It was from pre-Cro-Magnon man. And then you're trying to put on the complex layers of modern day society, modern day ethics, modern day philosophy on top of that, and it just didn't work. What would have worked for Mike is if he could have beat her over the head with a stick and then hauled her off somewhere and made her his. That would have worked for Mike, but anything else, no, not so much. So that afternoon, about 4 o'clock, Mike says, well, I gotta go now. So I say, great, goodbye. Tony says, great, goodbye, and Mike takes off down the road. Well, we didn't see him for 2 weeks. and this is the reason why. Mike went straight from the job site, drove 20 minutes to Angeles Millworks, sat outside the door there on the street, on the other side of the street from it basically, and became Stalker Mike. He proceeded to wait until she got off work so he could follow her home. Good choice, Mike. Because without you doing that little particular thing, we wouldn't have this story to talk about. Now, what made him think that this was a good idea? Again, who knows? He had outdated hardware that was trying to put new software. It just wasn't working. His brain was fried, cooked, you name it, it didn't work right. And here's just more proof of it. So by the time she pulls into her driveway, Mike has slammed on his brakes, thrown it in park, pulled the keys, and is running to her door of her car so he can help her out like a gentleman. Yay, Mike. Now, as you can imagine, when she saw Mike at her car door in front of her house, the things going through her mind were not, wow, what a neat guy. I wish all my boyfriends were just like him. Wow, I think I'm in love, or anything crazy like that. No, her response was to frantically find the mace can at the bottom of her keychain, rip it off the keychain, and to douse him with it as she screamed bloody murder. And of course, this action caused Mike to start screaming bloody murder even louder than her, because his face was on fire, and she had shot mace up his nose and his mouth and his ears and his eyes. He was maced very well. Almost as good as he got skunked by his skunk, but not, well, I don't know, comparatively, I think the skunk probably was worse than the mace. But we can talk about that or debate it at another time. But here Mike was, on the ground, retching in pain, writhing around, and then the neighbor kid, who was also in love with her but had a little bit more decorum than Mike, who had never approached her, never done anything weird, and who had a lot of anger issues, it kind of turned out, along with self-loathing and a lot of other problems that 17-year-olds might have, came over to assist her. But by the time he came over, Mike was incapacitated, and she was calmly walking towards her house to dial 911. No, in 1991, cell phones were expensive. She didn't have one. So, here he is. Mike is on the ground, 17-year-old with anger issues and all kinds of other problems, and you name it, decides that the thing he's going to do is he's going to be the hero of the day. He's going to save this young girl from Mike. Mike, who is now incapacitated, begins to get kicked in every place it's possible to get kicked. Mike's ribs end up being bruised, broken, legs bruised. Nothing else was broken but ribs, though, somehow. So he must have protected himself quite well with his hands or arms or whatever he did. But there he was on the ground. So by the time the police are called and come, two of them show up, and Mike is now just moaning in a pile on the ground. The 17-year-old has been crowned victorious as the winner of the battle of the guy who got maced, because he wasn't maced. He had a defenseless man on the ground who he kicked the snot out of. But he won, so he was the winner. And so as he became champion, he went home and he congratulated himself, however champions do that are that kind of a champion. So here's Mike again on the ground. So the police make sure that after they bump his head into everything they can find on the way to the car, that they throw him in there, still moaning in agony and pain, and then shut the door on him while they go get the police report from the young lady. So they find out that he had been there in the morning, had acted weird then. He came back at lunch and was asked to leave. Then he followed her home. Classic stalker. And that's what he got labeled. So they take him down to the police station now that they've got their testosterone. I am He-Man. I bashed a poor guy's head into everything I could find. So now he's concussed, broken ribs, maced. He's in bad shape. Mike is a one-hurt unit. And I won't say that he didn't deserve it because, well, he did. He's Mike. And this is the kind of things that Mike does. So Mike gets booked. He's not able to stand for his booking though, so he sits while they take his hands and get his fingerprints, and he's done this twice before for the same reason by this point. So Mike knows the drill. But when he can't stand for his mug shot and he keeps on falling over because he's in so much pain, they decide that maybe, just maybe, it might be a good idea to take him to the hospital. So at the hospital, they give him some painkillers. They assess all of his damage. They do put some bandages and even some stitches in for him and a few other things like that. And then he starts to talk. Now, when Mike talks, people listen. But it's not for the same reason that they used to listen to E.F. Hutton. It wasn't because of good advice, financially, or things like that. The reason that people listen when Mike talks is because of all the odd things that come out of his mouth. Mike was a little bit deluded already about this young girl, and then he begins to tell them how deluded he is with regard to her, and how he can't understand their love is such a great love, and all these different things. He's going off into Mike land over here. Actually, let's go this way because left field is more Mike's territory. So as we go off into left field with Mike, the hospital staff becomes a little bit worried about the safety of this young lady yet, because Mike is a nut. So they order up, bring the police back, and the police talk it over, and then they end up calling a judge, and the judge says 72 hours psych hold. So Mike gets to spend the rest of his time in the 3rd floor of the hospital there in the psych ward, where they gave him a nice thorium drip so that he could sleep, get healed up a bit, and maybe a little bit calmed down from his delusions. They talked to him quite a bit, I would imagine, on the 3rd day to find out if he was okay to send home. And on the 3rd day, which ended up being, I believe, either Monday or Tuesday, I'm not sure how they worked that, he must have went to court that morning. And I was able to get a hold of the transcripts. This is actually kind of funny. The judge looked at Mike's previous record with his 2 other restraining orders and gave him a new one. What a surprise. Told him not to be within 500 feet of this young lady ever again, which made it impossible for him to be the gopher / garbage man / general flunky that he was working for me. Going to Angeles Millwork, I would have to send him to Hartenagel, Building Supply, or to Thomas and Squim now, because he couldn't go to Angeles anymore because she worked there. It also meant that whenever he saw her in town, he had to run away like he was some kind of Monty Python fighting warrior there. Run away, run away! And that was his job from that point forward whenever he saw her. And so we had to help him appreciate what that meant, though. I'll talk about that in a minute. But the judge did say something that was interesting. In the court documents it says this. He gave him that restraining order, 500 feet minimum distance from this young lady, and then gave him time served. Told him it's okay. You've done so much damage to yourself, and so much damage was done to you by these other people, that we're going to let you off the rest of the way. Now, I don't know if this was a good thing or not, but Mike didn't do it again for the next year that I'm aware of, so I guess it's okay. But it's interesting. The prosecuting attorney really did not like that concept. He wanted to throw the book at him and maybe some other things, I'm not sure. He might even be in a chimp and wanted to fling feces at him. I'm not sure about that either. But so he let the judge know how he felt about it, that he was very unhappy. And the judge said, look, the guy is not a predator, he's just stupid. In the court documents, stupid. You gotta love that. And so here he is, stupid, labeled by the courts as stupid. So now you've got it. Mike is officially labeled by the courts as stupid. And that's what he was. Later on, when he came back to work the next week after he had healed up sufficiently and was able to move well enough to actually get to work, I had to get his truck out of impound and other things too. It was a mess for him. Incidentally, the 2 weeks that he was off of work were 2 weeks where he lost the money to pay for the nail gun. So I'm hoping that he actually took it back and got his money back, but I don't think he could actually go in the store, so he probably never did. So he probably was just out that plus the 2 weeks. So out really basically a month's salary over one girl. That was pretty good for Mike. So later on he comes in and he tells us about his woes at work, and of course we found them quite humorous. It was a lot for us to think about and to laugh about as he described the things that went on. And then when he complained about the 500 feet and how far it was, we weren't sure he really appreciated exactly how far 500 feet is. So we took land surveyor's tape measure, and we went out and took it from one end of a block, city block, down to the other, and then beyond it as far as it would go until we got to 500 feet. And then we had Mike stand at the one end and try to talk to me at the other. He got really upset when he figured out that you could barely even yell at a person that far away. He got so upset because of one reason. He said, "How will we ever be able to work things out if I can't even yell at her?" Thinking like a Mike. Now you know all about how Mike falls in love, the process that it takes, and what inevitably happens when Mike does fall in love.